1.5 FM in Santa Cruz. We're around the world at kpfa.org.
This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show.
So my grandfather was during that first wave, but a lot of his family members were in the second wave because there were already people established there who were writing back home and saying, it's great out here. I have jobs. I need to hire people. I don't know anyone out here. You should come down. And some families would come for the summer, and there were a lot more automobiles, and people were able, and there were, because of the World War II, there were more highways. And so people started to come as well. And that's why you have families, so many families in Detroit have roots in Mississippi, because there were some families in Mississippi that came during the first migration, and larger amounts of family came during the second migration. So it's not on accident that we end up in these other cities. It's very much because we all have roots elsewhere, and that's important to pay attention to and to honor.
A conversation on what's known as the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans in the 20th century would migrate from the South to the North and to the West, creating new societies and creating new social movements. Our guest for this conversation is Blair Imani. Blair Imani is a historian, a writer, and an activist. She has a new graphic novel that's called Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Blair Imani joins us next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. More than 1,100 former Justice Department officials who have served in both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations are calling on Attorney General William Barr to resign. In an open letter, they say Barr and President Trump have openly and repeatedly flouted the fundamental principle that bars political interference in a criminal prosecution. The letter points to Barr's intervention to overrule the team of prosecutors who recommended a 7 to 9 year prison term for Trump's friend and confidant Roger Stone. The 4 prosecutors quit the case after being overruled. The former officials say they welcome what they call Barr's belated acknowledgement that the Justice Department's law enforcement decisions must be independent of politics. But the letter says that Barr's actions in doing the president's personal bidding, unfortunately, speak louder than his words. The letter also urges existing Justice Department officials to follow the example of the 4 prosecutors in the Roger Stone case and be prepared to report future abuses to the Inspector General and Congress, to withdraw from cases if need be, and to refuse to carry out wrongful directives. Former federal prosecutor Ellie Honigsberg spoke to CNN.
I think courage is contagious, and we saw it last week when the 4 prosecutors who had tried and convicted Roger Stone and then been publicly undercut by Barr, which is such an unusual move, stood up and resigned either from the case or the Justice Department. And I'd like all the women and men who work at the Justice Department now to know that it is still okay to do the right thing. They can and should stand up against political influence, and that at least the 1,100 of us alums who are out here in the real world support them if they take that brave stance.
China says it may postpone its annual Congress in March in the face of the coronavirus outbreak that has infected more than 70,000 people on the Chinese mainland. The Chinese military dispatched hundreds more medical workers and extra supplies to Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak. Japan's health ministry has been carrying out tests on passengers and crew on the Diamond Princess, which is docked in Yokohama, a port city near Tokyo. Officials said they'd confirmed 99 more cases on the ship, bringing the total to 454. 2 chartered planes flew 340 Americans who were aboard the Diamond Princess out of Japan late yesterday. Some of the passengers are now in quarantine at Travis Air Force Base near Fairfield in Northern California, the others at a Texas base. Public officials and immigrants' rights groups are responding defiantly after the Trump administration said it is deploying U.S. border agents to pursue undocumented immigrants in sanctuary cities. Acting Immigration and Customs Enforcement Director Matthew Albence didn't specify the cities, and officials speaking on condition of anonymity said they include San Francisco, Boston, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and Detroit. Oakland's Mayor Libby Schaaf tweeted, "Don't bring it to Oakland. Our residents deserve safety and sanctuary in our streets." And she said Oakland will remain the most unapologetic sanctuary city in America. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot also weighed in.
The Trump administration made its latest play against our cities by yet again targeting our immigrant and refugee communities through its usual fear-mongering and xenophobia. We will not be bullied, period. Especially by a bully like President Trump, who trades in hatred and scare tactics.
Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Virginia Democratic Governor Ralph Northam's push to ban the sale of assault weapons failed after 4 Democrats voted to shelve the bill for the year. The 4 Democratic lawmakers joined Republicans on a Senate committee in rejecting legislation by Democrat Mark Levine that would have prohibited the sale of certain semi-automatic firearms, including AR-15 style rifles. The bill also would have banned the possession of magazines that hold more than 12 rounds.
Assault weapons and large capacity magazines have been used in virtually every recent mass murder. They were used in 5 out of 6 of the mass murders of the last 40 years. These weapons were used at Aurora, at Columbine, at Orlando, in Pittsburgh, in Virginia Tech, and Virginia Beach. These weapons are not necessary for hunting. They're not necessary for self-defense.
Gun owners accused the governor and others of wanting to confiscate commonly owned guns and accessories from law-abiding gun owners. Northam and his allies said repeatedly they did not plan to confiscate weapons. I'm Eileen Alfandary for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The Harlem Renaissance, the Motown musical explosion in Detroit, and the birth and growth of the Black Panther Party in Oakland are all historically important events that stemmed from what's known as the Great Migration, which millions of African Americans from the South migrated to the northern and western areas of the United States in the 20th century. Today we're going to be in conversation about this Great Migration, which many historians will divide into 2 periods of time, and all the differing histories we'll talk about that it spawned over the century. My guest is Blair Imani. Blair Imani is a writer and activist and historian, and she is the author of a new graphic novel that's called Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Blair Imani, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you to our radio station. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
I'm excited too, because it's an important topic.
Thank you.
I mean, we have the major work from Isabel Wilkerson, like some 10 years ago.
Yeah, Forms of Other Sons.
And even for me, that was sort of my introduction to this topic of the Great Migration, right? But I suspect a lot of people still don't quite know what that means when we say the Great Migration. So what was it?
So it was the largest internal migration in American history. It was when 6 million Black folks moved from rural areas to industrialized centers in the South, places like Atlanta, but also in the North, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, et cetera, Oakland, Los Angeles, Compton. And it was really because of domestic terrorism and because there was a dearth of job opportunities. But there are a lot of historians who talk about this as a voluntary migration, like a bunch of Black people just decided, you know what, I hate it here, let's go somewhere else. Not because they were forced out. Like my great-grandfather, he was forced to flee because the Klan was going to kill him because he went to work the following day after a lynching, and he was spotted going to work, and his boss says, you have to get out of town, take my car. And his family had to leave out of the house.
This is in Arkansas?
This was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And these are stories that I knew growing up, but I was always like, why do my friends and my friends' friends all have stories like this? It's because it was a massive migration.
Yeah, everybody had, like many people, especially African Americans,
have stories like
this that go back to the South.
Or even people who, after Emmett Till was murdered, I'm leaving because my child's teenage age, and I don't want him to die this way. I don't want her to die this way, or them, because non-binary people existed in the past as well. And I really wanted to capture that because, we still talk about, not we, myself and you, but at large, historians at large talk about the Dust Bowl as one of the largest internal migrations, which is inaccurate. And it also over-romanticizes the suffering of white folks at a time when 40% of farm and agricultural workers were African American, and a smaller percentage being Native American, folks who were impacted worse because they didn't benefit from the government assistance programs because they didn't own the land. And so I do a little dragging of folks like Ken Burns, who kind of play into that narrative, but does a great job on his film about Vietnam, really covering the Black community, which I also nod to. But folks like John Steinbeck, who really ignore the Black community. And I said this on Twitter, and folks said, well, there's one guy, his name is Crook. And I'm like, okay, so he called a Black character Crook. That's not representation I want. And one Black person does not account for an entire community. So it's time that we start to shift our view on not only American classics, but the way that we talk about American history, because how will we live in a society that honors difference if we have one story being told?
Now, oftentimes it's characterized as there are two great migrations that happened in the 20th century, primarily from African Americans in the South.
Yes, usually it's discussed from the 19-teens to the 1930s, which was a huge drop-off because there were no more industrial jobs to move into.
Yeah, the Great Depression, I guess.
The Great Depression,
too,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Everything was great back then. You know, it was basically the Great War to the Great Depression.
The New Deal, which
yes.
we don't call it great. Well, many people actually called
it the Great Deal, yeah. And then again, during World War II, there's a second migration, and that went until the mid-70s, the mid-1970s. And I discuss it as one migration for clarity, but in the glossary it does delineate between the two, because it is important to know when folks came. And so my grandfather was during that first wave, but a lot of his family members were in the second wave because there were already people established there who were writing back home and saying, it's great out here. I have jobs. I need to hire people. I don't know anyone out here. You should come down. And some families would come for the summer, and there were a lot more automobiles, and people were able, and there were, because of the World War II, there were more highways. And so people started to come as well. And that's why you have families, so many families in Detroit have roots in Mississippi, because there were some families in Mississippi that came during the first migration, and larger amounts of family came during the second migration. So it's not on accident that we end up in these other cities. It's very much because we all have roots elsewhere, and that's important to pay attention to and to honor.
That's interesting. So the first wave sets the stage for the second wave.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
There are some places like in Oakland and in Los Angeles that weren't fully captured by the first wave. Essentially, it was it followed war, and it followed industry because there was a labor vacuum. There were less European immigrants, and at the same time, you had farm workers who could no longer work in the South because sharecropping was running out of fashion, but also the cotton industry was devastated by a boll weevil infestation, and also, the conditions weren't favorable. You could make the same amount of money that you would in a month in a week in Chicago. So say you're in Mississippi working for a month, you make that same amount of money in a week. It seems very advantageous to move elsewhere. Now, it didn't mean it was bright and shiny. The streets weren't paved with gold, even though that was kind of the draw to get people to move in. It was very difficult. There was a lot of hardship still. There was poor working conditions. But the important part is that these people were largely safer, not completely safe from, but safer from the threat of being lynched, the threat of being killed just for being black. And I feel like it's relevant now because we have such a conversation about immigration and about refugees. Yeah. But black folks in America, we've been refugees as well. We're internal refugees, domestic refugees, because of domestic terrorism. And if we don't name these things, we can't understand them.
What was specific and important to know about 1910 then, when sort of this first wave, and I want to recognize you sort of just consider it one big great migration,
yes,
both of them combined, but what's significant about 1910? We're not in the war yet.
We're not in the war yet.
Yet.
But we are also kind of looking at the climate of the world, and then also realizing America has these industrial centers. It's post-Civil War, and so there are a lot of factories that are being converted, and there's the steel magnates, oil industries, America's rapid industrial growth. And you usually just hear about folks like Carnegie, folks, of that group. There's even whole documentaries on these folks. But who was working in their factories? It wasn't Europeans, because oftentimes it was Europeans, but during World War I, there was a slow in immigration, and black newcomers from the South, newcomers to the North, ended up filling up those pipelines. But there are also a lot of positions that would be considered quote unquote menial labor that Europeans and white Americans didn't want to take up, and so black folks were doing those things like domestic labor, things like service, and then you also have this kind of burgeoning movement of black creatives. This is kind of leading into the Harlem Renaissance, where this migration was not just one that was labor force. Well, music and singing is also labor. it wasn't necessarily just labor on assembly lines. It was also labor in the form of entertainment. And this intrigue into the Black community also came from the fact that, King Tut's tomb was found during this time. And so all of a sudden it was like, ooh, anything related to Africa is very interesting and very sexy. And so as these new clubs started to be built up, then we're moving into the 1920s, there was more interest about what are our Black neighbors up to? They live near us. It's kind of this... that Mayberry thing, the Andy Griffith Show, where Black folks are around, but we don't see any of their stories because it's segregated. Jim Crow is the name of the game. So what are they up to? And so that intrigue started to fuel more white interest into Black work, which also meant that white dollars were funding Black work through the Harmon Foundation, for example, for Negro excellence and advancement. And that started to fund new plays, and people who had been able to establish themselves in the teens and the tens were able to help the younger folks who were coming up to make their artistic prowess come forward.
The Harlem Renaissance, its connection to the Great Migration is important, I guess, to understand.
Absolutely. And
is it the children of the people who migrated in the teens, or?
Sometimes it is. You have Ariel Holloway, who does a poem in prose, and she had never lived in the South, but she does it in such a way which is very much like Mark Twain, where she uses the Southern vernacular. People also claim that Mark Twain was the first person to do that. Incorrect. But what we have with this is that she's talking about people migrating north, and it's interesting because you have a young Black woman from Brooklyn doing this this poem in the voice of someone from the South, someone who might be her grandfather, might be her mother or father. And it had so much critical acclaim, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily immediately authentic to her, but it was part of her story. And that was published in, I believe, Opportunity, which was a magazine created by different organizations. You had The Crisis, created by the NAACP, Opportunity. There were many magazines that were created by kind of these folks who came before and wanted to lift up these younger voices. But so the fact that she was born in Brooklyn speaks to the fact that it was sometimes the parents and grandparents. But this migration, while it's characterized as beginning in 1916 by most historians, it was happening from, pretty much the end of, or even through enslavement and, the Emancipation Proclamation, folks moving north, because it was dire. There were, after Reconstruction ended, especially 1896, when Dred Scott took place, this idea that you're not protected and the United States government is not going to protect you as a Black person, you had to leave because it was not safe. It was not tenable to be there. But as I say in the book, there were a lot of folks who decided better the devil you know than the devil you don't.
Yeah,
so they decided
so many
to stay.
people did stay, obviously. Mm-hmm. You still have very large African-American populations in the South today. I just want to stay on the Harlem Renaissance for a moment. A figure, does someone like Zora Neale Hurston play a role in this story? Of course, many of us know her for her novels, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but she's also a very important anthropologist who was keeping and preserving many African-American folk stories.
Absolutely. She was born in the South, and she kind of debuted on the scene, and the way that it's told, I tell it in the book, is that it was all very overnight for her because she was able to submit her work to these magazines that I was just discussing, and she would get awards for them. So she shows up to the Opportunity Awards dinner, and they're, acknowledging her for her play Color Struck. And there's just this intrigue about somebody who came. And so even for Black folks who are already established in the North, there was this intrigue in the same way that the white community was intrigued by Black community as a whole, for Black newcomers who had survived this violence, which was largely revealed to folks through these magazines as well. They were educational magazines for people who couldn't be right there in the intellectual discussions, could also have connections to them. And then you have the Pullman porters who would run the train lines and would also sell these magazines to their fellow Black folks. So it was very grassroots organizing. But Zora Neale Hurston, she was just such a vivacious figure. And what I talk about with her is that she had a chosen family of other luminaries during the Harlem Renaissance. And what I would also consider an early civil rights movement, because you have people like A. Philip Randolph who are starting to emerge and organize during this time, born during this time, and start to organize in earnest.
So, of course, A. Philip Randolph, an important union organizer.
Yes.
And early civil rights
Absolutely.
leader.
He and Bayard Rustin were very close throughout both of their lives. And A. Philip Randolph created the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And, sleeping car porters, they were often called George, which was the name of George Pullman, which is a really icky legacy back to slavery, where enslaved people were called their master's name to remove their identity or any semblance of individuality. So these folks, the porters, ended up establishing the black middle class. But one of the reasons why they were able to retain their jobs through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., was because wealthy white folks wanted to experience this luxury of having a black person wait on them after the institution of slavery was abolished. So it's kind of that weird moment where racism ends up helping people stay employed. Not necessarily a great thing, but an interesting thing to say the least. And so A. Philip Randolph wanted to provide more agency to these folks to organize, to make sure that they retain their jobs, to make sure white folks who hadn't been working there nearly as long didn't get preferential treatment, which is what we see in the defense industry, certainly. And then he and Abe Philip Randolph start to think about things like, how do we apply political pressure to the United States government? And they start to plan a civil rights march way before the 1963 actualization to start to force Roosevelt's hand in integrating the defense industry. And so these folks were really just powerhouses. And I think what was so important to me in this book was to not characterize them as gods or as mythologized figures, but to show them in their real lives with, some of their flaws as well, to say, these people aren't different from us. These people aren't heroic, mythological figures from the ancient stories like Hercules. Like, these are people who did things because they had to, and it means we can too, because so often we have figures like Martin Luther King who are essentially deified in the historical narrative, but he was an everyday person. He put his pants on one leg at a time. Yeah. Sometimes you jump into him, It's just the fact that he wore pants like a regular person. And I think that's an important point to emphasize, that history doesn't just happen in black and white. It doesn't just happen by ordained figures who are anointed by God. It happens with everyday people taking actions to make their world a better place. And people like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Zora Neale Hurston were doing that in earnest for the benefit of everyone.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with historian, writer, and activist Blair Imani, who is the author of the book Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. We're going to return to this program in just one moment after I tell you that this radio station is in its Winter 2020 Fund Drive, and that we are offering this very fine book, again, called Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream, for a pledge of $100 in support of your radio station. And what we will do in return is send you this fine. And it's a graphic novel full of really wonderful illustrations of so many historical figures of the 20th century, and how, and the telling of the Great Migration, and how this Great Migration throughout the north and western parts of the country, coming from the south, would really inform and infuse our cultural and historical heritage of the United States of the 20th century. And it's really fascinating to see how it all comes together in ways that I think a lot of us, and myself included at one time, didn't really think about it in that way. And the great thing about this book by Blair Imani is that she writes at the and lives at the intersection of Black, Muslim, mental health, and LGBTQ communities. And she has been able to bring all of these communities together in telling this incredible story of the Great Migration and how it would shape the 20th century and U.S. history in that. And we're very happy to be able to offer you this book. It's for adults. It's also for kids. And it's for young people. And it's a great way to learn this history. And we're offering it to you for support of $100. Our thank you gift is this book by Blair Imani, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. The phone number, and I'm going to give two phone numbers because we are on live both on KPFA in the Bay Area. I say both. There's more than two. KFCF in Fresno, K248 in Santa Cruz, and of course, KPFK in Los Angeles. So there's going to be two numbers I'm going to give that you can make a contribution and get this book, Making Our Way Home. For listeners to KPFA, KFCF, or K248 in Santa Cruz, Fresno, or the Bay Area, the phone number is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. 5732 and online at kpfa.org. I will give that number again, so please be ready for it. For our good friends in Southern California listening to KPFK, that phone number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735. Or there, you can also pledge online at kpfk.org. What I really like about this book is it begins during the time of Reconstruction, before what we consider the beginning of the Great Migration around 1910 or so. But what happened during Reconstruction, the terrors of Reconstruction, the shortcomings of Reconstruction, but even sort of the highlights and when Reconstruction worked for that very small amount of time at the very beginning of it. And we get the stories of people like Hiram Revels, who was the first African-American senator right after the Civil War. In fact, there were some 30 congressional members, first congressional members who were African-American, who went to Congress right after the end of the Civil War. It wouldn't last very long because you get the rise of Jim Crow out of this. You get the rise of the KKK. You get the rise of extreme white terror that would come after the Civil War. But you do learn the stories about PBS Pinchback, who was the first African-American governor of Louisiana. You have the stories of Ida B. Wells, journalist and activist. And then it'll take you into, again, it's almost like this tree, right? The Great Migration that is planted in the South and then branches throughout the rest of the country. And wherever it goes, it would branch a new sort of a new path of history. Right? You could talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which this book dives into, and get the stories of people like Elaine Locke or Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes. You get to the stories of the Black Panther Party in California. And what was really interesting, and again, what's really special about this book is its emphasis on intersectionality and how using people from diverse communities coming together to make social movements and to make social change. So in the Black Panthers, and I never see these in history books. Blair Imani includes a section about the sit-in of a federal building in 1977 in San Francisco by disability rights activists, an early major sit-in in which disability activists, and right there at Civic Center in San Francisco, overtook a federal building and occupied it for a month. And thanks to people like Bradley Lomax, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, the Black Panthers were one of those groups that would provide assistance to these activists who were inside the federal building by providing them lunches and food during their month-long occupation of the federal building over there on Civic Center. I mean, this is the kind of history I think we'd want ourselves, first off, to know, as we try to be more informed people and citizens, but also for our children, too, in telling this history in a new way that may not have been told before. So again, this book, Making Our Way Home by Blair Imani, is yours for just a pledge of $100. You're supporting this radio program and you're supporting this radio station. So our friends in the Bay Area listening to KPFA or KFCF in Fresno or K248 BR in Santa Cruz, the phone number you're going to call to make your contribution, and for $100, get this as a thank you gift, the Making Our Way Home. The number is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. Or online at kpfa.org. And for our friends in Southern California listening to KPFK, that phone number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. We now return to our conversation with Blair Imani. Again, she is the author of the book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Blair Imani. Give me that book back.
Yes.
Yeah. Blair Imani is the author of the book, Making our way home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. It is an illustrated book. Was that important to you?
Oh, absolutely. So Rochelle Baker did the illustrations. She's a Detroit-based artist. It was exciting for me that she was based in Detroit because that was a major center of the Great Migration. You have Motown coming from there. It's the Motor City. Motown is even called that because of the Motor City. And so it was really awesome to work with her. And I had not met her when I had her sign the contract to work with me. It was all through social media. And social media has played a major role in my publishing career. But working with Rochelle was great because she took it to the next level. She started to do historical research onto the color palettes that were common during that time period to make sure that the folks on the cover, that their fabric would have been readily available during the 1940s, which is supposed to be the era that's depicted. Making sure that we sat down and talked about how we were going to portray lynching, because the last thing I wanted to do was for people to open a book about Black history and to be re-traumatized. Yeah. Because one of the images that sticks out in my mind that I would see of people who looked like my family growing up would be this image of this man who has gashes all over his back being whipped and, just has keloid scars because his skin didn't even have time to heal before he was whipped next. And that's an image, that was probably the first time I saw a Black person in a history book, and how devastating. That's a real part of our history. It's a sacred part of our history. But what does it mean to show 8-year-old kids this image like it is not blood and gore, like it is just a fact of life? I think that dehumanizes. I think that it makes young kids and then growing up into adults numb to the trauma of Black people. And as we see that even in conversations around police violence. So we decided to just show a noose when it came to depicting lynching and put it on a red background to really underscore that this was something horrifying. And we talked about like maybe having an image and then have it like symbolically cut out the person who was being lynched. But I think I described it well enough. And sometimes images can harm, but sometimes images can help. And so that was a conversation that we really had. That was kind of, I think, the last image that was included, because we wanted to make sure we were doing it in a way that honored the lives of people who had been killed this way without portraying them as props or as something to be dehumanized further.
So these images are very deliberate to process.
Absolutely.
Coming up with them.
Yes. I mean, even in the front cover, I just spoke about on another radio show here about how I have my Uncle Lester being depicted with a partner. He was a gay Black man, and he's right there near the binding in a green suit.
That's your uncle?
That's my Uncle Lester, and he was gay, and he came out later in life, and he always lamented that he wasn't able to live his full life. And a lot of people today are closeted because they fear they'll lose their job, their housing. The Supreme Court was just deciding on that recently. I believe it was Title VII. And so he wasn't able to live his full life because social circumstances, and he had terrible anxiety. And so to kind of rectify this, he's in the original image, but next to him was a woman who they're not really looking too happy together. So I decided to make Uncle Lester look very happy with a partner of his own so that he could be, his out proud self. And further than that, I think it's important that there will be some people who pick this up because it's a great Black history book, but they'll also have a book that has a gay couple on the front cover. Yeah. And it's this overlay and this intersecting identity of gay or queerness and Blackness that I talk about at length in the Harlem Renaissance chapter even, and talk during the 1970s and the 1950s, how gay Black figures are part of Black history and a part of American history. But because folks have been portrayed as, new, this idea of, people call gender diversity a trend, but it's something, as old as humanity itself. So in history telling, I try to be very deliberate with the words that I use, with the examples I provide. And another thing with the images was I wanted to make sure it wasn't dominated by pale skin, because in the beginning chapter, a lot of folks who benefited from Reconstruction, who were appointed to positions, were lighter skinned because they were seen as less threatening. I talk about colorism, how people like myself would have been classified as mulatto, which means mixed. It's also considered a slur, so please don't go calling anyone that if you're listening. Things like octoroon, quadroon, people who are categorized by their fraction of white heritage. And I wanted to talk about that. And then as I get further into the book, I wanted to make sure that we're not just seeing the same people that we've always seen. I have 2 pictures of Martin Luther King. Both pictures, he's in community with people. He's hugging El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who folks know as Malcolm X. In another picture, he's speaking at the organizing of the SCLC, because he did not do this by himself. And I think that one of the harms of white history telling, whitewashing, is that we will be provided exceptional black folks who, or magical Negroes, as it's often called. This idea that one person in the black community was ordained and touched by God and able to bring their community to the mountaintop. But Martin Luther King, he calls himself a band leader for justice, somebody who wasn't doing it on his own, but might have been leading people. But it wasn't at all a solitary endeavor. And I think it's really important to capture that, to show that, no person is an island. We all need one another to get further and to get closer to justice. And so I wanted to be very intentional about those things. And then also making sure that as I depict figures who were influential in pop culture, to do the same thing, to make sure that, so we had an illustration that we were going to include of Lena Horne, who was a light-skinned black woman who talks about how colorism affected her relationship with the black community and also with white people and whiteness and white supremacy. And we had put a stop on that illustration, so I think Rochelle probably still has it in her files, because I decided that it may have been more important to include an illustration of the Supremes, or to include another illustration that elevated people who would be sidelined even within black history. In another place we did that, it's throughout the book, but the last example I'll give is with Claudette Colvin. And so in the chapter on the 1950s, I talk about Claudette Colvin and how she, unpreempted by organizing, refused to give her seat up to a white woman. She was a pregnant black teenager, brown-skinned, and she wasn't seen as sympathetic enough to the white public because a narrative had to be created, or at least that's what's said. And so then months later, Rosa Parks does that same action, but was doing so in her role essentially as the regional secretary at the NAACP, doing this strategically, which I think is important to talk about as well. Doesn't make it any less genuine. It's definitely an important tactic, but to make it seem as though it just happened by the wave of a magic wand really discredits and disadvantages the stories that we're telling. So I have Claudette Colvin visually placed higher than Rosa Parks, who is placed on the first page, but then I have Claudette Colvin raised higher as even a nod to the fact that she came first and that she needs to be prioritized because she has been deprioritized and erased. So it was all very intentional in the text. And so I think that's important, and I think it's important for people to know that I want to make sure that their journey through history is well guided, because for too long it has kind of just been thrown at us, and we're supposed to cling on to the things that connect to us, but sometimes we have to be guided and walked through it.
You mentioned the Supremes.
Yes.
Motown. Detroit.
Yes.
The Great Migration is instrumental in this explosion of art that would occur.
Absolutely. It was this coming together of different groups. You have Berry Gordy, who was the creator of Motown, who got a royalty check, I think, for $3.19 for writing songs, and was like, well, I can't do anything with this. My people are the people who are doing the vocals in the backgrounds. We're doing the horns and the cymbals and the drums. We're doing the melodies. We're writing the lyrics like he had done. And we're getting none of the money. We need to own our own work. And it's something that Jay-Z talks about today, so it's not something new. The other thing I talk about is that he crowdfunded. I use that word, crowdfunded, which is a more common word. And I remember going through it with the editor, and she was saying that's not a grammatical word. And I was like, it is now. Like evolution of language is always happening. So I included that because he basically asked his family for a loan, and he paid the loan back. But this was a common practice in the black community. Why? Because banks wouldn't give us loans. And there is the 1 cent savings bank, which is Citizens Bank today, which still is in operation. But essentially this idea that he crowdfunded to start his business and then went to the places where black folks were living, which were public housing, because the GI Bill was not proportionally distributed to black folks. So we ended up in public housing. And Diana Ross and the Supremes, they all lived in that same housing project, and their families had come from the South. So this kind of coming together.
I didn't know that background.
Oh, yeah. They were very connected. And even Diana Ross has a song about her mother and being ashamed of, her mother being poor and coming into wealth and fame and feeling like there's this disconnect. Not necessarily her own story, but a story that definitely a lot of black folks in Motown were feeling. There were other stories I didn't get to include about Motown, how there was one woman who focused on etiquette, and she would say, it doesn't matter where you come from. it matters where you're going. Like, don't discount yourself because you grew up in a certain condition. Be concerned about where you're going, what your trajectory is, because it can be as far as the moon. And she would teach them how to, properly eat with silverware and how to be genteel, very Pygmalion, like talking about how you put someone who isn't meant by society to fit into a space and making sure that there's a space for them. And that really benefited them as they were traveling across Europe and across the United States. And so, her family is Hollywood royalty today, but really knowing where these people came from and that it was not on accident is very important, because I want, a young girl who's a singer to understand that she too can do it. Seeing Diana Ross's story, or someone who doesn't necessarily think that Motown was influential. This was a crowd-funded effort created by one man's frustration, working together with the community and also sourcing from his community and bringing them together. And so that's something important too, because it is organizing, but it's within entertainment. But Detroit is an absolutely fascinating place because, going to the Motown Museum, which I highly recommend, was what I did to capture that story. And I also was able to meet Berry Gordy when I was, back home in Los Angeles. He's a family friend of a friend. And that story is just crucial because so much of that music then defines the following decades. You have War by Edwin Starr, which is an anti-war ballad, which was supposed to be sung by the Temptations, but it was too aggressive, I guess, in the anti-war conversations. So even thinking about how it was curated and how the younger people within Motown pushed the people like Berry Gordy to speak to the truths of their listeners and the lived experiences of their listeners, even starting out with Please Mr. Postman, which didn't depict black people at all because they were afraid they couldn't get plays. So there's a big story there.
Blair Imani is the author of the illustrated book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. It is an illustrated book that dives into the history of the Great Migration of the 20th century of African Americans from the South to both the northern portions of the country as well as to the western portion of the country. It's a powerful illustrated history of the Great Migration as 6 million African Americans left the American South, again, for both northern and western cities from 1910 through the 1970s, and its sweeping impact on Black and American culture from Reconstruction to the rise of hip-hop. This is Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, taking a quick break here before we resume our conversation with Blair Imani to let you know that we are in our winter 2020 fund drive. This is the time of year that we come to you asking for a financial contribution. This is public radio, and the way that we operate is the same way that we've been operating ever since 1949, when KPFA was born in Berkeley, California, is by asking for listener support. It is your support that makes this show, Letters and Politics, possible. It's your support that allows us to do all these historical related conversations that we have on air. I would say one of the few places on a daily where you could find these kind of conversations on a day-to-day basis. But for us to be able to continue to do this work, we need to be able to raise some money to keep this radio station on the air and to keep this radio program on the air. And today, very happy to be able to offer you, I think, a very special book, a book that I would hope would be a part of most people's libraries or have it right there on your shelf. It would also be a great gift. It's called Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Yours for a pledge of just $100. It's a fine hardback edition, Making Our Way Home. It begins in the era of Reconstruction, where you can hear and read about and even see portraits from the illustrations in here of the likes of Hiram Revels, who was the first African-American senator in Congress, PBS Pinchback, first African-American governor in Louisiana, Ida B. Wells, the great journalist and activist. Get into the Harlem Renaissance, Elaine Locke and Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. We just heard Blair Imani talking about the musical explosion that happened in Detroit, what we know frequently as Motown, and the role that has had in both its connection as well as the Harlem Renaissance, right? The connection to what we call the Great Migration, though many historians will consider it two separate great migrations, one that began really in the 1910s and the other the 1940s. Both World War I and II would play a significant role in these migrations. You get the stories in this book of people like Ella Baker, Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, Sylvia Rivera, and the hundreds of thousands of black women who joined the workforce during World War II. This book is yours for a pledge of $100, and the phone number to get it is, if you're listening to KPFA or KFCF, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. This book very much takes part in Los Angeles as it does in Oakland, two cities. And of course, we say Oakland, so did Richmond and San Francisco. And of course, Los Angeles is very important in this story of the Great Migration. And our friends in Los Angeles listening to KPFK can also get a copy of this book by giving us a call at 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. What I like about this book is how inclusive it is of many different communities in this story of the Great Migration, which is really also the story as it would, branch out throughout the United States and spawn all these other movements, whether if it be the Harlem Renaissance or the musical explosion in Detroit and Motown, or the birth of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, and how that would spread and its connections. But the fact that Blair Imani went to great pains to ensure that it was an inclusive book of including people from lesbian, gay, transgender communities, the disabled community, so many different communities that were also included in this book. I think it's one of those things that we want to promote here in year 2020 and make sure that even, young people have access to this kind of perspective and thinking about this history. So the phone number again for KPFA listeners is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, that number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. And just finally, quickly, we have a challenge. We have just 13 minutes to make it. Edward in Reno. Thank you, Edward. Edward is actually offering to put up $1,000 this hour. If we could raise an additional $1,000 between now and 11 a.m., my friends, that would mean $2,000 towards our goal. And that would be a big deal for me right now. And so here we go. It's an opportunity for you to double your donation to your radio station, opportunity for you to help us get where we need to be in order to continue to do this show as we move forward. So the number one last time for KPFA, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, or online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, it's 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. We now conclude our conversation with Blair Imani. Regrettably, we only have a couple minutes left here, but I want to ask you about the passing of stories, perhaps through families of the Great Migration. And your Uncle Lester,
yes.
Is this a story that passed through the family? Is it a story
certainly.
You got from him directly? Did you know
from my
him?
Grandmother.
You got it from your grandmother.
So I think he had passed.
Did you know him? He had passed.
He had passed. Okay. But another beautiful thing, I have another uncle, and he came out in the course of me doing this research with him to me. And it was really beautiful because anytime you can make your family members comfortable to be themselves around you, that is beautiful. And he was inspired by me. As being gay to me. And so that was really exciting. I don't want to out him on the radio, but that was really beautiful.
We're not, are we?
Oh, no, we're not.
Okay,
no,
good.
Not Uncle Lester. Yeah. I won't say the name of my other uncle. And so that was really beautiful because he came out as fluid and that he doesn't really identify as gay or as any sexual orientation, which is super modern. That's a thing that a lot of young people are doing. Not to say it's new. It's just the language he used was very in line with current conversations. And so with that story, it was really fascinating because I understood so much more of him. Because anytime someone is in the closet or has to hide an element of their self, whether you're hiding, that you were adopted, or you're hiding that you're divorced, or you're hiding that you're, queer, it puts a burden on you. You can't be your full self. You can't laugh the loudest. You can't smile the biggest, because you have to restrain yourself. And the story that I included that was kind of a passing down was the story of Georgia Black, who was a Black transgender woman who passed, I believe, in 1951. And her story was republished in 1975 by Ebony magazine. And it was kind of the situation of a doctor outing her upon an examination that she was not a cisgender woman. She's a trans woman. And her community refused to relent and, or not relent necessarily, refused to give in to the kind of sensationalism of the reporter. The reporter kept trying to say, but aren't you afraid of this? No, we love her. She's part of our community. She's part of our church. She's our sister. She's a mother. We love her. She lives as a woman. She's a woman, period. Her pastor said this. The white neighbors even said this. They asked the white folks who kind of during that time period and even today are considered the official weigh in on moral authority. And they said, she's a woman. We love her. She lived as a woman, period. And this is in 1951. And that's...
they liked her.
Yeah, they loved her, just like anyone else. And so I think that's beautiful, because even in the sensationalist headlines, which were not kind, which were not respectful, it still was it was still pro-human. And even though it was written in a transphobic manner, her community was not transphobic. Her community loved her. And while there might not have been the language to call her transgender or to describe her gender, she had a full life and a full family. And I think it's important for people to know that being your full self is not a new thing. Yeah. Barriers might present themselves that are newer, but it just means we have to fight harder. And so that was a story that was kind of passed down. And
how did your family tell the story of your uncle Lester?
Of my Uncle Lester.
Yeah, and in particular being gay. And of course, I don't mean to pry too much into
it's fine.
Your family business.
I think with him, it was the situation kind of similar to Georgia Black, where it was, no, he was gay, that's it. And I think there was this sadness because he was so isolated, this feeling of, sometimes in the Black community, we'll call gay Black men who are older permanent bachelors. This idea that, they're never going to get married because for a long time it was illegal until very recently. Or that you can never see their full life, or, this is so-and-so's roommate. This is, auntie so-and-so's best friend. Not necessarily that they're lovers and that they're together and that they have a relationship that deserves to be honored and heard and seen. Uncle Lester never had a partner that we were aware of, but that was part of the sadness of it. I think that, we wanted to make space, and we being my family wanted to make space for him to be his full self. But ultimately, it was up to him. He had to feel comfortable. But when I came out, that was kind of the thing. Where it's like, well, we have a gay uncle. You have this person in your family who's gay. And that's kind of what people often say, even Tim Cook, the Apple CEO, he's like, I'm a proud gay uncle. And I think that's often the caricature, or archetype is a better way of saying it. The archetype we have of somebody who is in our family who's gay, that people will often point to why they need to be progressive. And it doesn't have to be even someone in your family. We need to create a space where everyone feels included. And I think having Uncle Lester right on the cover of the book when he was when his life was so stifled by being in the closet is a step in the right direction of representing him and honoring his story. Yeah.
No, you're right. I have a gay aunt.
Yes.
And that was always sort of an indicator of,
yes.
Okay, we got to be cool.
Yeah.
Blair Imani, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Blair Imani has been our guest. She is the author of the book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration, and the Black American Dream. Of course, what made us cool was that we had a gay aunt. Everyone should have a gay aunt. I'm sure almost everyone does. Hope you enjoyed our conversation with Blair Imani. I know I did. This is an up-and-coming writer who is making strong contributions in the way that she tells history and the way that she tells the story of history and the way that she tells the story of history concerning the Great Migration of the 20th century. And it's just not some usual telling of the Great Migration, which even the usual telling is an important telling because this is important history, but the way that she does it by incorporating really diverse communities communities into the story of the Great Migration and how people who also were at the intersection of whether it be gay and lesbian or transgender or disabled or what other, Muslim, she does a history of the Muslim community in here as well, and their connection to this Great Migration throughout the 20th century that would grow. And really, it's kind of like, I see it kind of like a tree that's planted in the South and then just branches outwards to the rest of the country. And each place it goes, it recreates itself in some kind of historical, political, and cultural phenomenon to a new event. And what's beautiful about the 20th century is just because of the way of technology and being able to document history and culture and progress and even digressions, and being able to preserve those things, we still, we're able to map these things. And the way you're able to map it to what's known as the Great Migration is a really wonderful story worth knowing. And here, and this is the important thing about historians, is when you're telling new histories, of telling them with new questions. And now we have questions, well, how did gay, lesbian, transgender people participate in this, what we call Great Migration? How were other movements and how were other, social, political events influenced by what we know as the Great Migration? How was Motown and the Harlem Renaissance connected to Los Angeles and Oakland? How was the disability rights movement and their major, as Blair Imani writes about, again, of the major occupation of a federal building in San Francisco for 30 days? How the Great Migration actually played even into that with such people as Bradley Lomax, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, but also was supportive and providing food to the activists at the federal building in San Francisco in 1977. It's an illustrated book. It's a book that is for all ages, and it should be on everyone's shelf. And I hope you will help us here in our final 4.5 minutes of trying to reach this $1,000 challenge from Edward in Reno, who's put up $1,000. We are $300 away. I'm sorry, we are $300 towards that $1,000 challenge with just 4 minutes remaining. For a pledge of $100, our thank you gift is this very fine book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Just $100. It's a beautiful book. It's a fine book. It's a hardcover book. It looks good to have, not just up on the shelf or on a coffee table, but also in your hands, reading it, kind of getting this information, getting this history. For our KPFA listeners and also KFCF listeners and also K248BR listeners in Santa Cruz, the phone number is 1-800-439-5732. So if you're listening in the Bay Area or in the Central Valley, again, the phone number is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732 or online at kpfa.org. And for our friends in Southern California, that phone number, KPFK, is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735 and online at kpfk.org. We're now $400 towards that $1,000 challenge. Edward in Reno had a lot of money he could put up, and Edward, we're appreciative of that because we need those kind of contributions of $1,000 or $500 if people can afford that in order to make it. What we really ask for is people to do what they can according to what they have. Don't want you to bust the bank. Don't want you to not be able to make ends meet at the end of the month or the beginning of the next month. But we do ask you, if you have some disposable extra money in the bank or in your pocket that you could throw our way during these fund drives. It's how this radio program exists, how this radio station exists. We don't accept commercials. We don't take corporate underwriting. We fully rely on our listeners to be able to do this kind of work. So again, the phone number for KPFA listeners, we are now $400 towards that $1,000 challenge, my friends. We have just one person calling in. If we are unable to increase these numbers right now, it could be pretty problematic for us because Edward has put up $1,000. But if we can't reach that $1,000 mark, then we have to offer Edward his money back. And if he takes it back, that would be pretty. It would be disappointing. That's all I could say. But we don't have to be disappointed. We could still make it because we still have 90 seconds. KPFA listeners, here's the phone number. 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. And in Southern California, that phone number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. We're now $600 there. We're down to our final minute. My friends, final minute. This could be one of the best and important thank you gifts that we are offering in this fund drive. This fantastic book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. Yours of pledge of $100. Just $100 is all we ask. The number again for KPFA listeners. We're still $400 away. If we get 4 individuals going to their phone right now and giving us a call, it can get us there. It'd be big for us. We're now $300 away. 3 more individuals. So if you didn't think you're one of those people, you are. For KPFA listeners, 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. Southern California, 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735. Online at KPFK.